You're heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 118, covering the week of April 23rd through April 27th, 2018. Glad to have you back on the program. Glad to be here. Before we get started, all the usual housekeeping. If you like this podcast, please share it around on social media, and you can find us on social media. You can follow us on Twitter at Abbeville Institute. You can like us on Facebook at Abbeville Institute, and you can subscribe to our YouTube page at Abbeville INST. Also, if you go to our webpage, abbevilleinstitute.org, you can find all our social media buttons at the top of the page, plus our Amazon Smile button, so you can contribute to the Abbeville Institute if you are shopping on Amazon. It's all at the top of the page. And while you're there, why don't you give us an email address, and we'll give you a free ebook, Kirkpatrick Sales Emancipation Hell, and also you'll get our daily dose of Dixie Monday through Friday and our weekly email on Saturday or Sunday, which includes a link to this podcast. Also remember that we exist on your generous contributions alone, so while you're at abbevilleinstitute.org, go to the top of the page where it says support, click on the little support tab, and then you'll have a drop-down menu. It'll say donate or donor options, and you'll find all of our donor options there. You can become a supporter of the Abbeville Institute monthly for as little as $3 a month if you're a student, or $5 a month if you're not a student, or annually $25 a year if you're a student, or $50 a year if you're not a student. Plus, we have other levels as well. So consider making a tax-deductible contribution to the Abbeville Institute. I also want to remind you that we have our summer school coming up July 15th through 20th at Seabrook Island, South Carolina. Have a great topic. It's Southern Identity through Southern Music, and we do have a great banquet performance from the world-class period musician Bobby Horton, plus a number of other great lectures on Southern music and Southern identity. So you're going to want to be there. Space is limited. We have about 50 slots, so you want to get in touch with Dr. Livingston. All of that information is available on our website. Just look in the middle of the page where it says you're invited, and you click on that link, and it gives you all the information on how to sign up for our summer school. So it's going to be a grand time. I'll be speaking at that event, so you can come on out there and meet me as well. So please look into that. All right, well, the theme for this week, as we get started, is Unlearning Fake History. In fact, that was a title of one of the pieces that we published this week, Unlearning Fake History. And all of the different articles, except for one, and I'll talk about that one in a minute. It kind of stands by itself. But the other 4 articles for the week have to do with that particular theme, and that is one thing the Abbeville Institute excels in, and that's giving you another perspective on the South and at times the North as well. So this particular, or even international history, one of the other pieces weaves into that. So our role to explore what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition is also to give you a perspective on Southern history, culture, society, Southern views on government that you don't necessarily get in the mainstream. Though some of this stuff you do find in mainstream history, so you can't say you don't. But certainly to give you a different perspective, maybe than what you would get in your public school or maybe your university class. Because what we often see, and if you go out and look on social media, my gosh, when Confederate Memorial Day in Alabama on Monday, if you followed anything on social media, it was a hashtag Confederate Memorial Day. And all I have to say after reading much of the tweets that came from that is, bless their hearts. I mean, this is the perfect fodder for Paul Graham's Confederophobia. I mean, that's what it was. It was just ridiculous. As if you could define ridiculous, you could put these tweets and other things right next to the definition, because these people are lunatics. Not just that, they have an irrational fear of the Confederate flag and Confederate history, and Southerners in general. I mean, this is the problem because of the way they've been indoctrinated, and that's really what it is. It's indoctrination in the school systems across the country. They've been taught that the Confederate flag, for example, is the same thing as the Nazi flag, and that these people were just Nazis, modern-day Nazis. And you saw that in these posts. And so this is really problematic when you look at the number of Southerners that fought in World War II against the Nazis. In fact, Nathan Bedford Forrest's descendants fought the Nazis. And you could go across the board. That's just one example. But he's often pointed, there's a guy, he's a Nazi. And there was I saw a little while ago, there was another social media post. I can't remember what group was doing it, but they're going to college campuses, and they had a board with all these flags on there, the Soviet flag and several other communist flags, Cuban flag and North Korean flag, and then they had the Confederate flag. And they asked these snowflakes there, which of these flags is the most offensive? And they all pointed to the Confederate flag, an American symbol. They didn't know anything about the Soviet flag. They didn't know anything about these other communist flags, which the Soviet Union slaughtered. The Stalin regime slaughtered close to 10 million people in his time as dictator of the Soviet Union. Nothing like that ever happened in the South. Not at any time in Southern history did anything like that ever happen. So it's funny how people have been taught, well, that's a terrible flag. Look at that thing. But this is what we deal with. This is Confederophobia. This is why the Abbeville Institute exists. Because it's our job to find what is valuable in the Southern tradition and also to help people understand the South and understand Southern culture and history. And as we've mentioned on this podcast several times, not all traditions are great. Not all elements of every people are great. But what we want to do is ensure that we can pull the stuff out of the South that is valuable for today and understanding today, and also give you the complexity of history that we really should be going for if we are historians, to understand a people. That's what history is about, to understand a people in a time, not to pass judgment on them at all times, not to be saturated with the present view of things when we're looking at history, but to understand the people from the context in which they wrote and spoke and lived. And it's okay to admire Confederate soldiers, and it's okay to admire Southerners from the antebellum period. It's okay to admire Southerners in the postbellum period. The left does this all the time in some ways. When you look at, and I remember reading a piece that was written about the mid-20th century South and how some of these Southerners were so important in building the New Deal and creating this progressivism of the middle of the 20th century, but they were just perplexed about how these Southerners on their views on civil rights, and essentially what they're doing is exactly what we do at the Institute. Yeah, these things were good and these things weren't good. So can we not admire someone for the things that we think are still valuable today and say these things weren't good, so we don't want that, but we do want this because this was definitely part of the Southern tradition moving forward. So all of these pieces this week, many of them are actually an attack on the North and what the North is doing. In fact, 2 have to do with the Lincoln regime. Actually, 3 have to do with the Lincoln regime, and 1 has to do with a topic that is sensitive on college campuses, but we'll talk about it anyways. So let's start with this attack on the Lincoln regime. The first piece of the week was entitled The Pickens Plot. It's written by a resident scholar in Japan, John Marquardt, and I like this piece for a number of reasons. But most importantly, and I think people picked up on this, in fact, it was called one of the best pieces that we've ever published on the website on social media. So I know Jack listens to this podcast, and so there you go. Now, thanks for writing something that people loved so much. And I'm sure they would love to thank you in person. But this particular piece is interesting. It's the Pickens Plot. And I've been to Fort Pickens in Pensacola there several times. It's a really nice place to visit. It's beautiful beaches. You go down the road there to Pickens, and you're in this nature preserve. It's just a beautiful place. I mean, no buildings, beautiful pristine water, beautiful white beaches, and you get down to the fort, and the interpretation at the fort, it leaves a little bit to be desired. But regardless, it is a beautiful place to go, and if you ever get a chance to go to Santa Rosa Island there and travel down to Fort Pickens, it is highly worth a visit. But Fort Pickens was also integral in the development of the war, in the coming of the war in 1861. And what this piece does, and I think very effectively, is show that the war was actually premeditated by the Lincoln administration. This is something that most people don't think about, because oftentimes you hear it was Fort Sumter. The first act of aggression was Fort Sumter. Southerners fired on Fort Sumter, and that was... Lincoln was just trying to avoid war. He had no interest in war. He had no interest in going to war. He was completely taken aback by this. But if you read good histories, you know that Lincoln was certainly interested in war before it began. In fact, he remarked that way. He said this is when Southerners fired on Fort Sumter in April of 1861, that was the desired effect War came. He wanted the war because he wanted to have the rub. But what you find with Fort Pickens, and I love the last paragraph of this particular piece because it gets into that particular issue. He says, Jack says, quote, as a footnote to these events, while visiting Fort Adams in Rhode Island during 1881, one of the veterans from Company B of the 5th Georgia Regiment, who had been a 15-year-old drummer boy at the Battle of Santa Rosa, Hugh G. W. Johnstone from Idlewind, Georgia, happened to meet Israel Voges, I think, who was then a brigadier general and had only recently retired from the Army. While the two were reminiscing about the attack on Fort Pickens, the general told Johnston that after his capture he had been one of the 13 Union officers sentenced to be hanged in reprisal if the crew members of the Confederate privateer Savannah, which had been captured near Charleston that June, were executed for piracy in New York. He said that fortunately for all concerned, the charges against Captain Thomas Baker and his 12 sailors were dropped, and that a year later both he and the Confederates had been exchanged. He also spoke of President Lincoln's actions prior to the start of the war and admitted that he now agreed with Navy Captain Adams that the original order in March of 1861 to land his troops on Santa Rosa Island would indeed have been an act of war. As a part of the general added that he had only later learned that his landing to reinforce Fort Pickens actually took place several hours before the bombardment of Fort Sumter had commenced. While he did not say so, it should certainly be obvious that his admission also provides added evidence to the charge that Lincoln's strategy had been to force the South into firing the first shot in Charleston Harbor, a move designed to allow the North, and of course history, to lay the onus of the war at the doorstep of the Confederacy. So this was premeditated. This was premeditated. Lincoln's actions were premeditated to bring about war. This is what he wanted, whether it was at Pickens or whether it was at Sumter. It's remarkable that both of these forts carry a South Carolinian for their namesake. Whether it's at Pickens or Sumter, he wanted war. And he was going to goad the South into an act of war by his own actions. And of course, that was the result. So far from being the pacifist, the man dragged screaming and kicking into war, the man who didn't want it but yet had to face it, as you'll see on Republican propaganda, or even some non-Republican propaganda, Lincoln was certainly a warmonger. He was looking for war, he got the war, and we had 1 million casualties as a result. So I think that this little story does a nice job in explaining that. Now that said, on Tuesday, Lincoln, as we know, was not a popular president. The man was elected in 1860 with under 40% of the popular vote. 1864, he received over 50% of the popular vote, but only in the North, and he got less than 60%. It was around 56% of the popular vote. So we know that 44% of the northern population didn't want him to be president. If you add in the South to that, I mean, the South could still have voted in that election, which they wouldn't because they were an independent country at that time. But regardless, Lincoln wouldn't have gotten 50% of the vote again. And it's amazing he only got 56% of the North, 44%. And that might be even be skewed, as we've seen from some recent studies that deal with that issue. Jonathan White, who's a professor in Virginia, has written a wonderful book on this and looking at the voting records. And it's determined that, wait a second here, there's a lot of Democrats that didn't vote or were coerced into voting Republican, so Lincoln may not have had that kind of advantage anyways if it wasn't for voter fraud. But we know that there was certainly a large percentage of the northern population that did not support Abraham Lincoln. And the book review we had for this week by Joe Wolverton, Knights of the Golden Circle, deals with one of these groups, one of these clandestine groups that was supposed to be out there opposing Lincoln. And of course, this is one of those groups that was often held up as evidence of the shadowy underworld of opposition to Lincoln, where they wanted to create a break the Midwest off and create a different Confederacy. And of course, Lincoln's dealing with this. This is why Vallandigham was arrested. And so you have all this stuff working in the background. And Joe Wolverton does a nice job with this book. He does think the book is worth reading, though maybe it's not as good as it could have been, particularly when the author uses words like maybe, likely, it seems that, and there's a lot of conjecture in this particular book. So, it's always important to take some of these modern historians with a grain of salt and understand that they're going to do things at times with the view of the present in mind, to write books that that may not always meet your expectations. And Wolverton says this: with the foregoing in mind, those desiring an understanding of antebellum, bellum, and postbellum America and the dramatics personae that played significant parts in those acts, both on stage and behind the scenes, would be well served in considering Keene's contribution to the Civil War corpus. He is a reputable researcher, and his narrative is readable and enjoyable. Just keep in mind that during the 1850s and 1860s, the smoke of secrecy was not always a sign of a fire set by the secessionists of the Knights of the Golden Circle. And that's often, where you're looking at who these people were. Were they that influential? How much influence did they have in the Midwest? What was going on here? And so he says, Keene has done a great job in bringing this forward and bringing to light this group, but it still leaves a little bit to be desired. But certainly, you had a large percentage of the population that believed this shadowy organization was behind all kinds of things. Their involvement in Lincoln's assassination, for example, and their involvement in these treasonous activities in the North, quote-unquote treasonous activities in the North. So this is a nice addition, as he says, to quote-unquote Civil War literature, though it could have been better done, better produced, better written. But certainly it's a topic, and as we look at topics that are worthy of study, the North is really the area that's the fertile ground, so to speak, for looking at the war, because the South has been done and done and done, and of course it's because there's a Southern Studies at every university in the country. But really what we should have are Northern Studies. In fact, next week we're going to have a piece that plays into that. The Deep North is the area that needs to be studied more and more, and as you look at, for example, we're going to talk about slavery in a minute. As you look at pro-slavery ideology, what you find is that the North, not the South, was really in the vanguard of pro-slavery ideology. And so the North is really the area that needs to be studied. It's not that the South wasn't important, it wasn't unique, and it was in its own way. But a lot of the things we find so repugnant about American history, if you just want to look at it from a modern viewpoint and say these things are bad in America, come out of the North, not the South. In fact, when you look at race relations, slavery in general, a lot of the things the South is criticized for often came from the North. First and foremost, it's just the South hung on to them longer. All right, so those are nice little pieces. And then piggybacking on this idea of these shadowy organizations that are causing problems for the North, we had a piece on Friday entitled The United States of Despotism, written by Louis Liberman. And this has to do with John Marshall's American Bastille, which I've read several times because of my work with Delaware during the war period, and James Byard and some of the things going on in Delaware. And so this particular book gets into the situation of political prisoners in the North. And the book details the accounts of the imprisonment and sufferings of approximately 70 people at the hands of the state. Pastors, judges, U.S. senators, doctors, farmers, editors, foreign ministers, even women. And they're from places like New York and Pennsylvania, Illinois, California, Missouri, Iowa, Kentucky, Maryland, Indiana, Ohio. And so this is a forgotten part of the war. The actions the Republican Party took in putting people in jail. And several years ago, I think it was, I can't remember the year, it was 2012 maybe, We did a conference at Stone Mountain, Georgia on this, and that turned into our Abbeville Institute book, Northern Opposition to Mr. Lincoln's War. And I did a talk on Delaware in that particular conference, and there's a chapter on it in the book. And what you have in that, and what you find, first of all, Thomas F. Bayard, who was later U.S. Senator from Delaware, Ambassador to Great Britain, and Secretary of State, was actually thrown in jail during the war for being a Southern sympathizer. And that's unprecedented if you think about it. Here's a guy that would later become one of the most important people in American history, jailed for being a Southern sympathizer during the war. Jailed. He wasn't just under suspicion. The Union Army came into the state and threw him in jail. Again, that is really unprecedented. It's dangerous if you think about what was going on there and how many political prisoners there actually were. And I know people have minimized this. Mark Neely has said, it wasn't that bad. It was exaggerated. 30,000, that's exaggerated. And most of these people were just catch and release kind of thing. But think about the tyranny of that. People that simply oppose the Lincoln administration, which Thomas Francis Bayard did, quite vociferously, in fact, are thrown in jail under mere suspicion. And his father had to go and essentially write very stern letters and get him out. His father was sitting in the Senate. His father was a U.S. Senator at the time that this happened. And also under suspicion for Southern sympathy, which was actually warranted. James Bayard wanted Delaware to secede. But, that said, Thomas Bayard is thrown in jail by the Lincoln administration, a political prisoner. And so this book is wonderful. We've got a link to it. It's free. You can go out and read it for free online. And to read the accounts as Louis Liberman has done in summarizing some of these accounts. I mean, this is horrible stuff. It's also there's one of the condensed versions that he puts in the piece is a story of a woman who was arrested and put in Camp Douglas, Illinois. There's actually a great video out there entitled 80 Acres of Hell. It's a documentary about Camp Douglas. Wonderful to watch. Highly worth your time. It's amazing the History Channel even did this thing. But as we look at political prisoners and discourse, public discourse, all kinds of things, we should remember this stuff. And this is why certain, Jonathan Turley, for example, has been so critical of the Lincoln administration because of their suppression of civil liberties. And he's a leftist, but yet he's interested in an administration, an executive that does not abuse power. And certainly the Lincoln regime abused power. But again, this is history that you often don't hear about. If you're going to get your textbook, there's not going to be much written about this part of the war at all. You're not really going to find this much. So this is unlearning some of your fake history. And then within that particular context, the piece on Wednesday was actually titled Unlearning Fake History. And this is a story about the last slaves imported into the United States. And they were imported from West Africa, from the Kingdom of Dahomey. And the Kingdom of Dahomey was probably the most infamous of all the West African kingdoms. In fact, these last slaves were imported just before the war began by Maine slave traders. Of course, they brought the slaves into Alabama, and recently the boat that they were brought on has just been found. They brought them in, scuttled the boat, and then left it, abandoned it. And so they think they found the remains of this particular ship. But it was Maine slave traders, New Englanders, but they went to the Kingdom of Dahomey, and these people that were captured as slaves, and their community still lives in Alabama, they were captured by a group of women. There were these Amazon women who went in and essentially smoked these people out of their camp, and then they had the men out there to capture them, and these people slaughtered people, they beheaded people. I mean, this is horrible stuff. And then, of course, they're sent over to the United States. Now, this particular story, where Beau Treywick gets this from, is from Zora Hurston, who wrote in her Dust Tracks on a Road about this particular case of these Africans who were enslaved by other Africans. I mean, this is something that's well known. But not if you look at social media, not if you look at mainstream history. I mean, nobody knows this stuff. Even W.E.B. Du Bois mentioned this in his book, The Suppression of the African Slave Trade to the United States, and he said, look, New York, Boston, Portland, these are the largest African slave trading ports in the world at the time. But Zora Hurston concluded in her book that she said this, it was the inescapable fact that stuck in my craw, was my people had sold me and the white people had bought me. She said it did away with the folklore she had been brought up on, that white people had gone to Africa, waved a red handkerchief at the Africans to lure them onto the beach and aboard of the slave ship out of curiosity, and then sailed away with them. But no, she said, her own people had butchered and killed, exterminated whole nations, and torn families apart for a profit before strangers arrived. And all that Lewis had told her was verified from the other historical sources, which impressed upon her the, quote, universal nature of greed and glory. And this is what we got into last week when we talked about the attack on Marshall DeRosa and the slave trade and these type of things. But this is, again, the stories aren't told. If they were, we would have a much more complex view, and I think would lessen racial tensions in America. It would lessen the us versus them mentality. Because history is what it is. And no one today had anything to do with any of this stuff. No one was part of it at the time. No one took part in any of it. No one was a victim from it. No one. But to understand it, I think would actually go a long way to solving some of the tension in the United States. That there were many people that were involved in this, North and South, and in Africa itself. So no one is guiltless. But yet, that's what you get. That there are guilty and there are victims. But in this particular case, no one is guiltless in the institution of slavery from a perspective of societies that were involved. North, South, Africa. And I think that's what I loved about this little piece. Really got to the heart. It's a terrible story. Really got to the heart of that, though, that how horrible this was. And that it was, as Zora Hurston said, my gosh, these are my own people doing this. This wasn't somebody else. It was my own people. We need to reconcile. We need to figure this out and come to grips with that. Because if we do that, it changes the entire narrative of American history. And of course, when you look at Confederophobia and other things, this just goes into it because the narrative is this stuff never took place. This never happened. That's fantasy. But no, that the lost, quote unquote, lost cause is fantasy. And that's he begins it saying, there's an African American columnist in the Richmond Times-Dispatch who says, the lost cause is fantasy. But this is really the history that's not told, and people don't know this stuff. Even though the major textbook of the time on the African slave trade gets into this particular major textbook, the current major textbook gets into this, but people just don't read it. They'd rather have their myths than their legends, which is the lies and legends of the Civil War, which you can get on Fox News if you want it. Unfortunately, it's on Fox News, so I've been subjected to it. Now, the last thing is the last piece I want to talk about is a poem by Paul Yarborough, and I'm not going to read it, but it's a nice tribute to the Confederate soldier for Confederate Memorial Week. And this is one thing you'll find as you go out and you look at these monuments and the dedication ceremonies and everything that was involved in that, and the outpouring of emotion that the citizens of the South felt about these monuments and why they were doing it. When you look at the inscriptions on these monuments, when you look at the orations, the orators of the day, and the speeches that were made, and the ink that was spilled for these men who had lost their lives, there's nothing more tragic in American history than it. Nothing. It's a defeated people. The South, the Southerners, are the only defeated people in American history. The only ones. You could say, well, we lost the Vietnam War. Sort of. Of course, we did have this Vietnam syndrome that we had to overcompensate for in the last half of the 20th century into the 21st century. But the South really has been the only people thoroughly defeated and occupied in American history. That's it. And so the emotion, the outpouring of emotion for these men, for their cause of independence, this is what they said, it's the cause of independence, for that is real and tangible and genuine, and for people that mock it or belittle it or say it's some nefarious reason, these people were simply mourning their dead. The amount of men killed and wounded when 75% of the white Southern population fought in the war, 75%, 3 out of 4 men, and the sacrifice that these people made, the women and the people on the home front, white and black, when you read the sacrifices all those people made. And not just that, there were, I was just reading the other day, the history of black slave owners in South Carolina. The Coger book, Black Slave Owners. And he actually had a chapter in that on Charlestonians, black Charlestonians who supported the war, supported the independence of the South. And there was an effort made at one point in the South Carolina legislature to say there were no, free blacks were not allowed in the state. The legislation was tabled very quickly in the South Carolina legislature just before the war. But there was a letter to a Charleston newspaper talking about how these people were valuable contributors, that we had lived side by side with them for years, and that such a piece of legislation was harmful and preposterous to even propose. But yet, that's not going to be discussed. And of course, Coger is an African American, and he wrote this as part of his work at, I think it was Howard University, to look at the black slave owners, which he had heard about, but never really found anything much, never found much about them. But he wrote a whole book on it, Black Slave Owners in South Carolina. So the South is much more complex, and the outpouring of grief is real. It's something that we should all have a certain sympathy for and understanding for. Even to this day, the men and women who are descended from these Confederate veterans feel something real for their families and for the cause of independence. And of course, when we talk about things like decentralization and oppressive government and valor and honor and these things, no one exemplified that better than the Confederate soldier. And so that's what Confederate Memorial Day is all about, and why it should be celebrated, North and South. Because these men are recognized as American veterans by the United States government. Confederate soldiers are. And so to minimize this day, to say that it's simply just to mock it or to cast it off as some old-fashioned defense of some nefarious thing in American history is simply untrue, and I think destructive to what the meaning of that day really was, and how these people who had suffered so much just simply wanted to remember the men who had died in the cause of independence. And again, when you look at the monuments and you see what was said at the time, this is what you get out of it. Until next time, good day.